When you think of young kids, you don't usually think of self-control. Let's just talk about first self-control and when does that usually happen in children?
Self-control, we can also use the term executive function, which is a more broad term, and that has to do with the mind's ability to regulate thought, action, emotion. So that's the broader concept, and that develops dramatically between 3 and 5 years of age. It starts to develop earlier, but you see these really dramatic changes at between 3 and 5. And the same with self-control. And that's part of why I study children, because I'm interested in how these things develop. I'm interested in the nature of self-control, the nature of executive function, and one way to understand it is to look at how it develops and how it changes. And with kids, you can create these situations where you can give them some experiences and see how that affects them. Whereas I think with adults, that would be a little trickier, just because they're so wise to the world, and especially in experimental situations where you can't, they're kind of, coming into the situation with a bit of skepticism. With kids, they're just kind of being themselves, and you just, you can do things like what I did in this experiment and push their self-control around a little bit.
What were the ages of the children in your studies, and for how long did you study?
These kids were around 4 years of age, give or take, and they came into our lab for one session.
And how long was the session?
It was about 45 minutes.
Which is kind of amazing for a 4-year-old to do something.
Okay, so then really what happens, because with research with children, there's all these other factors. Like, it's not like getting an undergrad into your lab and just plopping them in front of a computer. It's, you bring them in, they have to warm up a little bit, play with some toys while the parent does the consents and everything, and then you gotta sometimes kind of negotiate with them to go down the hall to get into the room. Some kids don't want to leave their parents at all, and it's just a non-starter, and that's fine. We're very flexible, but it's kind of an art just working with children that age, especially. The 3-year-olds are actually like the real difficult ones to work with. The 4-year-olds, it gets a little bit more flexible.
Is self-control learned?
I think the answer is really complex. I don't think it's something that you can just say it's either learned or it's not, or it's innate or it's not. Kids definitely come into the world with their own dispositions. Some kids are more, they want to have things under control. They want to wait for those 2 marshmallows just because, whereas other kids, they really come in the situation very tempted to eat the marshmallow that's sitting right in front of them, even though they want to wait, but they kind of just want to eat it. So it's like you definitely have individual differences, and those are shaped by the environment, parenting, genetics, whatever. But you can still move things around a little bit with experience. And in this case, we were really interested in how context shapes self-control, or how it influences self-control. Or to be more specific, it was really about whether self-control can be influenced by norms and values. There's different ways to talk about like the bigger picture of what I was trying to do with this project. One thing that I've thought about for a while is just, I don't know if you're aware, but there's a lot of interest in executive functions, a lot of interest in self-control and training it. And part of this has to do with this increased interest or awareness of brain plasticity, and there's also just increased cultural interest in self-control, and just knowing that it's related to so many positive outcomes. So people want to harness that, and knowing that, the brain is plastic, and we can find a way to train these things, and everyone will be better off. And so that's kind of led to some interesting approaches to training. And so you've probably heard about brain training, like luminosity and stuff like that, which is more about adult cognition. And then there's also just training with young children with executive function. And some of this stuff involves, computer tasks and, stuff that just doesn't seem to make sense to me. Like I don't see how training a kid on a computer task, like giving them an executive function task, is really going to transfer to these other things that you want your kid to do better at, like math and reading. And we know executive function is related to math and reading, but it just doesn't follow that putting them in front of a computer game that is exercising executive function is then going to lead to better reading or math, you know? So that kind of made me think about, well, then what is it that people should be looking at? And, you know, in one particular case, they had kids kids from, I think, from homeless backgrounds or very disadvantaged backgrounds doing these computer tasks. And I was like, what is that going to do? Like, they're going to go back into their own environment where there's going to be different expectations of their behavior and different norms and things going on around them, and that's going to be what dictates their behavior. And so that kind of got me thinking about how I could show or test this idea that there are these group influences on self-control or executive function. And so I took advantage of this pre-existing work where you can actually get kids to identify with a group very easily just by giving them a t-shirt. And actually they did this with adults originally. Give an adult a t-shirt, or I'm not sure if they gave them t-shirts in the adult work, but you know, just telling them you're going to be in the X group and really nothing much more than that. And people actually show preferences for the people in their group, even though they really don't have any genuine underlying reason to associate with these other people. And in our case, the kids were assigned to a group. They were given a t-shirt and said, you're in the green group and you're going to wear this t-shirt. And then I asked them, you know, who do you think is nicer? I showed them pictures of kids with green t-shirts and kids with orange t-shirts. So the orange t-shirt kids would be like the other group, and they tended to prefer their own group members. And that's been shown in previous work. So I was confident that that had worked. And then I introduced them to the marshmallow test, which is a very famous paradigm where kids are given the choice of having one marshmallow right away, or if they can wait for the experimenter or myself to go to the other room and get 2 marshmallows, then they can have 2 instead. And you know, the vast majority of time kids say that they want to wait for the 2 marshmallows, but the real test is how long do they actually wait.
Did you leave for like same amount of time?
Yeah, so what happens is you leave the room and then we watch them from another room, so they're not in there just by themselves, because of course if they get upset then we would have to go back in. But we will leave them alone for up to 15 minutes. So, and that's what you have to do in order to really see these individual differences, because, you know, every kid, maybe not every kid, but a lot of kids can wait, you know, 1 or 2 minutes, but how many kids can wait 15 minutes, you know? So, and so the thing that I did in this study is I introduced them to the marshmallow test, but then I said, before, like, let me think, I can't remember exactly how this went, but I introduced them to the marshmallow test, and then I said, but listen, your group, the green group, they waited for 2 marshmallows, and this other group here, the orange group, they didn't wait. They had 1 right away. And I really just showed them a picture of these kind of hypothetical group members. It's not like these people were in the room or anything like that, right? So that's kind of how, like, even with that, kids are still pretty compelled to, you know, prefer their group. And then, so I told that to some kids, and then other kids I said the opposite. Your group didn't wait for 2 marshmallows. They had 1 marshmallow right away, and this other group, the orange group, they waited. So, and then I said, okay, so now I'm going to go and get that other marshmallow, and I left the room.
And what did you find? What were the results?
The main finding is that kids who believe that their group waited for 2 marshmallows are themselves able to wait longer for that second marshmallow. And then, so on the basis of that, there's still this question of, okay, so why did the group have that influence? My hypothesis is that it has to do with group values or norms. They're seeing what their group's doing, and they're internalizing that as something that they want to do too. But you could say that maybe they're just imitating their group members, so maybe it's just this short-term kind of transient thing. So I did a follow-up experiment where I repeated the first part that I just told you about, and then I also added an extra part at the end where I showed them pairs of children. There were these like kind of hypothetical scenarios. I showed them pictures of pairs of children and said, this kid waited for 2 stickers, and this kid took 2 stickers right away, and which kid do you like more? Which kid do you want to play with? And I showed them a whole bunch like that. Stickers, cookies, money, so not just marshmallows. And we found that the kids who believed that their group waited for 2 marshmallows also tended to prefer these hypothetical kids who were not group members, like they weren't wearing green t-shirts or anything. These were just random kids. They also tended to prefer those kids that waited for things. And so that told me that it wasn't just, they're just copying these other kids just because it's their group members.
So these are the same kids then that you brought back?
No, it was a second study, but they did both parts. So they not only showed that they could wait longer, but they also showed that they preferred
They did the
other
marshmallow
kids.
test as well as what you're talking about, the third part.
I replicated the first results, so I know that this is a robust finding. And in addition to that, I found that they also tended to prefer these other kids who were not group members, who tended to wait for things.
What about the kids who you said your group did not wait for the second marshmallow? What did you find there?
Basically, the main comparison is between those 2 contrasts. So either the kids heard that their group members waited, or they heard that their group members didn't wait. And it was always contrasted with this opposite group who did the opposite. So it's on the basis of this, we don't actually know, is it because of their group members, or is it because they're reacting against these other out-group members? That's something that could be explored in future research. I tend to think that it's more about the in-group's behavior. One reason to think that is because I coded some of their verbalizations while they were waiting in the room, just to see kind of what they were, because I noticed actually when I would go back and look at the video footage that some of the kids seemed to be talking to themselves and talking to the picture. So I left them in the room with a picture of the group members. It kind of was a representation of what I had told them, that your group, like the one group, had waited for 2 marshmallows. So it was like a picture of 4 kids in green shirts and had an arrow pointing to 2 marshmallows versus 4 kids in orange shirts with an arrow pointing to 1 marshmallow. So kind of remind them this is what the groups did. And so while they were waiting, a lot of them would kind of like look at the pictures and talk. And I was like, what are they saying? So I got one of my research assistants to go back and code it. And they tended to talk more about their own group. They just talked about the green group. So I think that it was just a way of like distracting themselves and helping them kind of wait longer.
Like adults, they know they're being looked at, they know they're being watched or studied, but kids.
It's easier to kind of do these experimental setups. Another thing is that we asked them at the end, why did you wait? And the kids tended to say they waited because their group waited. So, I mean, it was pretty clear cut.
I was reading about kids mimicking their parents' self-control or being influenced by parents' self-control. Was there a way to know the peer influence is a pretty strong influence on self-control? It certainly isn't just about parents.
Right. And there's some people who really think that it's mostly peers and not very much parents at all. So this has kind of been a debate for a long time of like how much influence do parents actually have versus peers versus just who the kid is. And also the same thing can be said about peers, like children can select themselves into certain environments and peer groups because of what they like. So it would be really difficult to, and this is one thing I wouldn't want the take home from this research to be, that parents should kind of micromanage their kids' peer groups and try to arrange for their kid to be in a group that has more self-control, because first of all, self-control isn't everything. And there's a lot of other things that matter, and being spontaneous and creative and whatever, like, not that that contrasts necessarily with self-control, but there's just so many different things that make us human, and self-control is one of those things that's good, but there's so many other things, and you would never want to have your peer group all, kids that have good self-control.
What is the takeaway information for parents?
I think it's possible that if families use that kind of language where they are emphasizing that there's a norm in the family or a group norm that's at play, where, self-control is a value, and however it doesn't have to necessarily be a group thing, but it's just some way of showing that this is a value that we care about in this family, and maybe even articulating the reasons why. And I don't know, if the kid is really young, they might not get all of that, but kids are very perceptive, I think. And I think sometimes parents are already doing some of these things. Maybe they don't realize it. Like, I talked to one of my friends about this study, and she said, "Oh yeah, we've done that with Nico. We tell him that Daniel Tiger does that. Like, so Daniel Tiger likes to clean up his toys. So, like, to try to kind of encourage him to do that." So I don't know if it actually worked, but those kinds of things, like, I think those are worth trying. Like, I think when you're talking about, it's not really about comparing to others. Although, like I said, with the study, there was the in-group and there was the out-group. So it's not clear whether this would work if you don't have an out-group. Like, you might want to be drawing contrasts with others who don't do the things that you do. I'm not sure. Like, that's something that needs to be explored. But I would say, like, within a family environment, it would probably be more effective if it was more of like, this is a collective family thing, not like, oh, this is what you do and your sister does this instead, or, or you should be more like your sister. Like, that's probably not really what is going to be as effective. So parents might be concerned, like, oh, like, and this is something I worry about, is like, parents might think like, oh, he goes to school and then he sees all these kids, and there's that one kid, he's always just like flying off the handle, and he hangs around him, and I don't know how I feel about that. Well, it's not just simply that your kid is getting exposed to other kids and that's just going to rub off on them. It has to do with group identity. So your kid has to actually, I think that they would have to identify with other kids and then adopt similar norms and values. And I think kids are pretty sophisticated in in how they interpret their environment, and that they can see, they can recognize when somebody's doing stuff that's not really what they like, and they don't, just because they're around other kids doesn't mean they identify with those kids. Like, they're around all different kinds of kids all day, and only some of them are they going to have this like strong feeling, like this bond with. And so I think there's a lot of interaction going on between what a kid themselves prefers and what they're seeing other kids doing, and who they end up identifying with, and then who they end up sharing their values with.
How many kids were in the study?
In the first one, there were 30 kids in each group. And then in the second one, I boosted the sample size to 45 in each group. So that's 90, so 90 plus 60, in total about 150.
Based on this study, what do you think needs to be looked at next?
I definitely think, like, right now, I know that there's this effect. In the moment, kids are influenced by what their group's doing, but how long does that last? Like, is that going to actually shape their development over time? So I think really the developmental questions are the ones I'd want to ask next. Like, how do groups actually, or how do group norms and values actually shape the development of self-control and executive function?
Is there a way that parents can use this information to better serve their kids?
Honestly, I think the best thing a parent can do is just try to understand their kid. not to try to go in and maneuver to kind of manipulate the situation by trying to use, certain language or, I really think what this suggests and this is the direction I'd want to go in the future is just to really get a better understanding of context and how that influences self-control and executive function. Because there's context and then there's the individual and there's these interactions. So, some kids really like to play guitar and they're going to use self-control in order to learn how to play guitar. And that's something that a parent should be attuned to. Like, some kids are just going to be more creative and they can use self-control, but in certain contexts, they might be much better at it than you trying to get them to use self-control in this other context over here. And so I think there has to be some flexibility in that. Like, of course, all kids have to go to school and they have to learn certain behaviors in order to be successful in school. But, you can't just mold a kid into exactly what you want them to be. You have to recognize who they are and how the context relates to who they are.
It sounds like what you're saying too is just because if they do not show self-control in a particular area, maybe they'll have a ton of self-control on something completely
There's a
different.
whole other conversation about the marshmallow test itself. Like, I had never done it before this study, and I, quickly realized that there's all these other factors that play into whether the kid eats the marshmallow or not, like whether they had a snack before they came in, and
whether or not they like marshmallows.
Exactly. And like, we actually, in order to avoid expending resources on kids that the data weren't going to be very good, I started asking, do the kids like marshmallows? Can you please make sure they haven't had a snack right before they come in for the study, and things like that, just because the more you have all those factors, the more noisy the data are and the more kids you need in order to get like a signal out of the data. So, and then, I'd talk to parents while I was waiting, and it was fascinating because some parents they would sit there and be like, she's going to wait. Like, I know she's going to wait. That's just what she does, And then in other kids, the parents were completely surprised at what their kids did. And
what would you like policymakers to know about the work that you're doing?
Because what really matters to me is how reliable developmental science is. Like, how likely is it that any of these research studies are going to replicate if you do them again with a new sample, or you do it the exact same procedure? And I think that that's really important, like, because we have this taxpayers' money is supporting this work, and I'm sure taxpayers want the research that gets produced to be reliable, and any policy that gets developed on the basis of this research should be, it should be based on really robust research. And that's really important to me. So I think that policy experts should look for markers of how reliable the research is. So what's the sample size? Was it pre-registered? Pre-registration is a big thing in psychology now, where you actually say what your hypotheses are, what your analyses are, and you document that ahead of time. So you can't go back and change it afterwards when your results are different.
If you can just tell me about your educational background, where you went for undergrad, grad, PhD.
I completed my undergraduate degree in psychology in Toronto, Ontario, at York University, and then I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota at the Institute of Child Development. And then I came here and did my postdoc at the University of Colorado.
In Boulder.
In Boulder.